Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this 30-minute session on job crafting, and look forward to spending a brief moment with you to give you some very practical tools for you to go back to your businesses or organizations and start considering job crafting. Job crafting's been around probably for, well, 20 years now. It's not a new concept. But I must say it's been very slow to get off the ground. So I think now the time is very ripe for it because we're now coming out of COVID, and it does give us opportunities to look at job crafting as a concept. So let's have a look at my slides and we'll launch into it. You'll receive a copy of the presentation and the recording at the end today. So you'll get all of that, which I'm sure you'll find helpful. So just for those of you who don't know much about me, I should just give you a quick introduction. Tim Baker, obviously. I write books. I've written 13 books, including my latest book, which is Breaking the Proactive Paradox. And I also am a keynote speaker. I run workshops. And in my spare time, I still play rugby in the Golden Oldies competition here in Brisbane. And we play every second week because it takes 2 weeks to get over our injuries at my age. So there you go. All right. So one of the key objectives of this whole concept is it sounds like a great idea, but how can it be organized? So the idea of job crafting sounds good, but how can it be done? Well, hopefully I can respond to that question today and help you with that. So in fact, what I'm going to do is just talk briefly about what job crafting actually is. And then I'm going to, in fact, I'll show you a couple of examples of job crafting. And then what I'm going to do is, how do you actually go about it? What are the steps involved and how could you implement this? And at the end of the presentation, I've got a special offer for you that you might like to take advantage of today. All right, so let's look at the concept of job crafting. The first thing I would say to you is there's a high correlation between what people actually enjoy at work and what their strengths are. So if you really want to know what people's strengths are when they work for you or in your organization, it's pretty much what they enjoy. And in fact, that's a very good question to ask people. And I'd urge you to do that. If you actually, when you get together with someone, if you ask them the question, what's the one thing that you enjoy most about your work? That will give you a very good indication of their strengths. Now, of course, if you could ask somebody and say, look, what do you think are your strengths? It's likely that people will duck and weave a little bit because it's a little bit of a confronting question. So I think a far better question is, what do you enjoy doing most in your job? And whatever that is probably a clue where job crafting can take place. So it's a good inroad into that conversation about how they might craft their job. Now, I should say to you that we all job craft anyway. So what happens, of course, is that when you come into a job, whether it's a managerial job, whatever the job might be, what tends to happen is that you get a job description. And what happens is, of course, you do the things that you enjoy and perhaps spend a little bit more time on them. You don't neglect the things that you don't enjoy, but the fact of the matter is they're not as enjoyable. So it's likely that perhaps you'll spend less time on them. So what happens over the course of time when you're in a job is that the job itself actually changes. So it actually changes to suit your particular strengths. So we're all doing this anyway. And what it means is basically that if you're in a job for 2 years, after 2 years, the job has actually changed. Why? Because you have changed the job somewhat by who you are and what you prefer to do. So we're doing it anyway. So we might as well look at doing it in a much more formatted way. And that's what I want to talk about today. So what is job crafting? Now, essentially, when someone's crafting their job, what they're doing is they're changing the job somewhat to suit their circumstances or their strengths. Now, please understand me. I'm not suggesting, of course, that people can go off and do whatever they want. That's not what job crafting is about. There are some core responsibilities in their job description that people must attend to. That's what they get paid to do. So we're not expecting that people just go off and create a job. However, within the job parameters, that is what people have got to work with, there are three ways that they can job craft. And the most obvious way, of course, is task crafting. And what task crafting ultimately means is they either do more of a task, less of a task, or they modify the tasks so it suits their requirements. Now, that's the most obvious way of job crafting because it's the most, it's the most visible, of course. And you could argue that most people job craft that way. But there are two other dimensions to it. There is the relational crafting, and that is building up alliances and stakeholders within and beyond the business to better do their job. So people might, for example, decide that they need to build better working relationships up with a stakeholder. So they work out how they're going to do that. Or they perhaps need to keep somebody in another department informed. So they do that. So relational crafting is working with and through other people to get the job done. Now, the third area is the most interesting area. That's cognitive crafting. That is actually reshaping and changing the way you think about your job. And so if we think differently about our job, it can increase our intrinsic motivation. So, for example, if you're a policy officer in a government department, you might see that as dull and boring work, because most of it, of course, is about writing reports, and perhaps some of those reports really don't get looked at. So you kind of feel as if you're wasting your time, and that might be your perception of the job. But what if you saw that as an opportunity of being able to reshape and craft a better society? What if you saw these policy documents that you were creating as an opportunity to leverage your influence so that you could create a fairer, better functioning, more efficient and effective society? Now, obviously, if you came at it from that point of view, you would clearly have a different motivation for your job. So let's have a look at some examples of job crafting, because at the moment that's just a concept. So let's actually look at some examples. Now, I'm going to give a couple of examples of skilled and professional working environments, because job crafting is accessible right across the board. So let's look at Paul. Now, Paul works in IT and customer support. Now, he spends most of his time on a helpline. So he's basically working with people to solve their IT problems. But he has a passion for testing and improving software. So that's ultimately what Paul really likes doing, and he's very good at it. So he discusses this with his manager, and Paul decides to join a group that tests new applications before they're launched in the company. So that takes up perhaps 3 hours every month. And so he gets involved and engaged in that activity, which is really his strength. It probably helps him in the customer support role anyway, but he's basically, exercising his strength. So Paul's role doesn't substantially change through job crafting, but he's delighted because he gets the opportunity to use his skills and passion in analysing applications and being recognised. So there's an example of task crafting. Here's another example. Harry's a bus driver. Now, Harry decides to give helpful sightseeing advice while travelling his regular route from the airport to the city. So his job is basically about picking up passengers and taking them to their motels. But he's mindful that many of those passengers are from out of town, and Harry perceives his job as more than driving a bus. Remember, I talked about crafting, talked about cognitive crafting. So Harry sees his job as much more than a bus driver. So he's cognitively crafted there. And by using his extensive local knowledge, Harry decides to use his extroverted personality to good effect. And he decides to add sightseeing to his primary task as driving a bus. Now, you could imagine that that's going to add a degree of satisfaction to his job. He enjoys interacting with the people on the bus, and he can add value on their way to the motel. So you can see there's an example of task crafting and cognitive crafting mixed together. One more example. So Marilyn is an architect, and she specializes in designing offices for large companies. So her job, their niche, her architectural firm's niche is to help companies design office space. She goes out of her way to organize several informal meetings with her clients on the new office design project. So she actually goes out of her way and talks to some people who actually work in that building. And during those meetings, Marilyn, instead of looking at the current office layout, she observes the way people are interacting with each other. So she notices how people do their work, how they interact. And after several visits, Marilyn changes the office design based on her observations and interactions with the customers. So we've now got Marilyn using relational crafting by holding meetings with her clients so that she can understand and appreciate how people get their job done. But she's also, of course, using cognitive crafting because she sees herself as more than an architect. She's actually there to provide solutions for her clientele. So you can see some examples, some very simple examples of job crafting. So I'd urge you now to think about your own workplace and how people may be able to craft their jobs. And to do that, and before we launch into how, let's understand that there are probably 3 groups of people that you should target in your workplace for job crafting. Older employees have a wealth of knowledge, usually because they've been in the industry for a long time. And assuming they've got reasonably good communication skills, if you can capitalize on that knowledge and get those people to mentor some of the younger workers in your industry, that's going to be of great benefit to those younger employees, but it's also going to give those older employees more job satisfaction where they can actually share their knowledge with other people. Now, you've got employees with disabilities or health problems. Now, obviously, people who have disabilities and health problems are going to find it quite challenging to be able to do what's required on a generic job description. So that group of people would definitely be open to the idea of crafting their job to suit and tailor their own disabilities or health problems. Now, the third group that comes to mind are parents of young children. Now, parents of young children, and those of us that have been through that, would understand that that's enormously stressful and time-consuming. And these parents who are also employees may need a little more work-life balance in order to make things work in that environment. So therefore, they are definitely a group open to job crafting. So if you're wondering where to start, there's 3 possibilities, but of course, it's open to anybody in your workplace to job craft. So it's not something that's closed to one particular group or whatever, but they're 3 that come straight to mind. Now, let's talk about what you need to do. Now, obviously, I go into this in some detail in my book, Breaking the Proactive Paradox. But just to give you a sense of what the 4 steps are in job crafting, the first step that's important here is that you give people some training on what job crafting is and what it isn't. Now, of course, I'm giving you an overview of that today. But, if people don't understand what job crafting actually means, it can be a problem because they might assume it just means that I can do whatever I want, or it's not applicable to me or whatever. So we need to explain to people what job crafting actually looks like. So we give people some training. Now, you don't have to have a huge amount of time put into that, But people need to understand, well, one, what is job crafting? Two, what are the benefits for me? And three, how could I actually go about it? So this is an informative exercise that gives people a sense of what's required. Now, if your organisation is very serious about this, then of course you need to give everyone the opportunity to be exposed to this training. And by giving everyone the opportunity, you're sending a very clear signal that job crafting is a critically important part of our role. Now, I mentioned earlier that job crafting's been around for 20 years. And I think the truth is that it's only coming to the fore now. And I think part of the reason for that is that because of COVID, we had people working from home. We had all sorts of unusual arrangements, and still do to some degree, hybrid working arrangements and all the rest. And because of that, it was absolutely imperative that people had to change their tasks and what they did in their job. So there was a real opportunity through necessity to job craft. And I think perhaps now people are realizing that, hang on, this is actually quite a sensible way to go. Why be hamstrung to a job description when in fact people can do more than that, and perhaps they can be more effective? Because when people get a job description, it's usually generic. And of course, the person has to try and fit in with the job description. But that's not really very sensible. Why aren't we actually looking at what people can actually contribute to the job? And why don't we just exercise that a little more effectively? And I would suspect that if you did this across your organization, you would see the benefits are quite significant. I mean, first of all, you'd see enormous engagement. Engagement levels would rise. You'd see productivity levels rise. You would see morale rise and all sorts of things. But of course, you've got to do it correctly. So in order to start that, you need to induct people into understanding what it actually means. So that's step one. So once everybody's done the training, the next step is that you're asking people to record their work activities for a week. Now, this is a little bit of a pain in the neck because obviously it means that you've got to document what you do for a full week. Now, why should we do that? Well, if I asked you what you did last week, it's probably likely that it'd be a little bit vague. You'd probably say, I had a meeting here, I did this over here. You'd have some sense of what you did, but it wouldn't be terribly detailed. So by recording your work activities for a week, you've got a really clear handle on what the week looked like. And you might say, well, why should it only be a week? Well, normally what happens in a week is a realistic depiction of what you would normally do for most of the year. So a week is a good sample to work with. And what that requires is people just recording in intervals the activities that they were doing at the time. And it's not, of course, to check up on people. It's really to give people some really good data to work with at the end of the exercise. So everybody does that for a week. And then at the end of that week, we then perhaps bring people together, and you can do this in a range of different ways, but we bring people together and we ask them to reflect on their week. So what that means, of course, is that they'd go through all of their activities for the week, and then they'd look for opportunities during that week by looking at their work activity recording and look at some of the things that they've done and some of the opportunities that are open for either task crafting, relational crafting, or cognitive crafting. So you give people a chance to really consider where they might start with their job. And I should point out that this is a very exciting concept because it is completely driven by the employee. Sure, the managers have to provide the right environment for it to happen, but the truth is it's the employee who actually initiates the job crafting, because it won't work otherwise. If you as a leader or a manager say to someone, I'd like you to do this, or I'd like you to do that, that's not job crafting. That is you giving them a direction as to what they should do differently. That's not job crafting. And of course, people don't own that. and therefore they'll probably do it because you've asked them to do it, but it's unlikely to be sustainable behaviour. So by doing it this way, we are using what we might call a bottom-up approach to be able to change the workplace. So people will have a conversation amongst themselves. You can do this in small groups and look at opportunities where people can actually shift or change the way they do things. Now, of course, the manager needs to be involved in this, because obviously you need to know, if you're the manager, what's going on, what people are considering doing, and so forth. So once people have had a bit of a conversation about this, they sit down with their manager and say that this is how I might do things differently in my job. And of course, as the manager, if you think that's a smart idea, then of course you can endorse that. And in fact, more than endorse that, you can support them. And we'll get to that in a moment. Now, step 4 is where people then, well, they have these conversations with their manager. But more importantly, they also have these conversations in their teams. So what you do is you get your teams together, and each member of the team shares with the other members of the team how they're going to craft their job, having spoken to you as the team leader. Now, why would you do that? Well, it's a very important step, actually, because if people are deciding that they're going to do less of this or more of that, or they're going to liaise with these people when they hadn't done that previously, whatever that might be, it could have an impact on other team members, and team members need to know that before it happens, because another team member might say, well, hang on a minute, if you do more of that activity, you're going to be impacting my work. And then they explain that. So you need the team to actually agree on the plans of each individual team member and how they'll go about job crafting. So that's extremely important. And that makes sure that, there are no gaps missing, that makes sure that people aren't duplicating work. It makes sure that people aren't stepping on other people's toes. So once we've had all of that, we're now in a position where the person can go off and craft their job based on their own plans, their own initiatives, and you'll find that it works extremely well. The most important thing for a leader in this activity is very much to be supportive. In other words, to create an environment for this to occur. Because if you do that and you create the right environment for people to job craft, then of course they feel safe and have the knowledge, of course, that whatever they decide to do has been accepted by you as a manager. So that's essentially the process that you'd use. It's pretty simple, but it can be extremely effective. Now, if you're a team leader and you say to yourself, well, I don't have control over our whole organization. Now, if you don't have control over your whole organization, you might think, well, I can't really do job crafting. Yes, you can. First of all, you might want to look at your own job, but you probably are in charge of a team. Now, if you're in charge of a team, that's a great place to start. So why not get the team to job craft? So you might just start working with your team members using this kind of formula. And then, of course, if it works, and I'm sure it will, you can then, of course, talk to your colleagues across the organization, and perhaps they might adopt the same sort of methodology when they're working with their team members as well. So that's a few little tips on job crafting and how it might work. And if you've got any questions about it, you can send me an email, and I'm more than happy to respond to that. Now, many of you are loyal followers on a Friday, and every Friday I have one of these short, sharp sessions. And I've got another session coming up next Friday on the 24th from 10 to 10:30. They're always at the same time, unless there's some reason I have to change it. It's always 10 to 10:30, Australian Eastern Standard Time, of course. And next week, we're going to look at the concept of the proactive paradox, which is essentially the title of my book. And what is it, and how can it be broken? And the proactive paradox is really about getting people to come to work with their brains, not leaving them at the gate, and being able to exercise a little more empowerment in the work they do, using independent judgment and autonomy. And I'm sure you would agree with me that that can be enormously frustrating and doesn't always happen. So you'll notice there's a link down the bottom, and you just have to click on that link. And of course, just as you did today, you can register for that webinar. And of course, you're in and away you go. So that's something you might like to consider. Now, the other thing I'd like to let you know, and I know some of you have already done this, but if you'd like to purchase my book, Breaking the Proactive Paradox, you can do so. Recommended retail price is around $53 plus postage. And unfortunately, because I have an American publisher, you might say, gosh, that's a bit expensive. And unfortunately, I don't have a lot of say in that. But with the American dollar and the exchange rate and where it is, that's the price. But nevertheless, I'm offering you today the cost of $27 plus postage. And if you'd like to take advantage of that opportunity, you can send me an email by the close of business today, and I would be more than happy to send that out to you. Thanks, Craig, for the great feedback. I appreciate that very much. And I'll just stop sharing now. So you just send me an email and I can organize that for you. I'd also say, keep your eyes peeled, because you'll receive in your inbox today a copy of the slides and the recording of today. So you might like to have another look at how job crafting works. So folks, that's pretty much it from me. Thank you very much for your attendance. I look forward to hopefully seeing you next Friday for another session that's practical and something that you can use very quickly in your own workplace. Thanks, everyone. Have a wonderful weekend, and we'll catch you sometime in the future. Thanks, everyone. All the best and goodbye.